The doors would not open. I told myself that was impossible, because I had walked through those same doors 3 hours earlier with my camera bag over my shoulder and a checklist of lighting angles in my head, and no door that lets you in should refuse to let you out. But the brass handle turned uselessly under my palm, and when I threw my weight against the old oak, it gave nothing back except a hollow, final-sounding thud that echoed up into the rafters like the chapel itself was laughing at me. Outside, thunder rolled somewhere over the hills, and the stained glass windows above me flickered gold and violet with a lightning strike that never quite arrived as sound. I had stayed late at St. Adeline's, the little stone chapel the Vale family had rented for tomorrow's wedding, because the light through the west windows at dusk had been so beautiful that I wanted test shots before the real event. I photograph weddings for a living, or I did, back when clients still called me instead of the string of newer, cheaper photographers who hadn't yet learned that beautiful pictures take patience. St. Adeline's was a good gig, a rich one, the kind that could carry me through a slow season. Now it looked like it might also be the place I died of boredom, locked inside a building full of white roses and unlit candles, until someone noticed I was missing. I checked my phone. One bar, flickering in and out like it was embarrassed to admit it existed. I tried the side door near the vestry. Locked. The caretaker's door behind the altar. Locked. Someone had gone through this building at closing time and sealed every way out, not knowing, or not caring, that a photographer with a lens bag and a granola bar in her pocket was still inside adjusting a tripod. I was halfway through composing a text to my sister Mara, trapped in a wedding chapel, please don't laugh at my funeral, when I heard it. Footsteps, soft, uneven, coming from behind the altar. I have covered enough weddings in old buildings to know that empty churches are never quite as empty as they look, that they creak and settle and make sounds that mean nothing. This wasn't that. This was footsteps, deliberate ones, moving with the particular unsteadiness of someone in shoes that didn't fit right, or in no shoes at all. My hand found the heaviest thing I owned, which happened to be my camera, and I held it up like it might do anything besides take a very well-composed photograph of my own murder. "Hello!" My voice came out steadier than I felt. "The venue's closed. I'm just the photographer. I got locked in by accident." A woman stepped out from behind the altar, and every rehearsed sentence in my head evaporated at once. She was wearing a wedding dress. Or what had been a wedding dress, before something had happened to it. The delicate cathedral train torn at the hem, one strap hanging loose off her shoulder, the bodice smudged with what looked like dust and rain both. She was barefoot, holding a pair of ruined heels in one hand by their straps, her dark hair falling loose from what had clearly once been an elaborate style, now collapsing pin by pin. Mascara ghosted beneath her eyes. And even like that, especially like that maybe, she was staggeringly beautiful, in the particular way people are beautiful when you've only ever seen their polished, photographed version and are suddenly confronted with the real one. I recognized her face half a second before I recognized what that meant. Seraphina Vale, the Vale heiress, the bride whose wedding I was supposed to be photographing tomorrow morning, to a man named Julian Crest, in front of 400 guests and, I'd heard, at least 2 television crews. "Please don't scream," she said, and her voice shook even as she tried to steady it. The practiced composure of a woman, raised in front of cameras, fighting against something rawer underneath. "I need you to tell them I was with you all night." I stared at her. Thunder cracked again, closer this time, and the candles that lined the aisle, someone had lit them earlier for the rehearsal, and no one had blown them out, guttered in a draft that shouldn't have existed in a sealed building. "I'm sorry," I said. "You need me to what?" "If anyone asks." She crossed the space between us in bare, silent feet, and up close I could see her hands were shaking, could see a thin line of blood at her collarbone where something, the dress, a piece of jewelry, I couldn't tell, had cut her. "You never saw me run, you saw me stay, all night, with you, here. I don't even know you." "I know." Something cracked in her voice on the second word, small and human, nothing like the poised heiress I'd seen in society pages for years. "I know that. I'm asking anyway." I should have been afraid of her. I was. A little afraid of the situation, of the storm, of the fact that I was locked inside a building with a woman who looked like she'd fought her way out of something and might still be running from it. But underneath the fear was something else, something that made my chest tighten in a way I didn't have a name for yet. She looked at me like I was the only solid thing left standing in a world that had just come apart around her. "Why are you asking a stranger?" I said carefully, "instead of calling your family or the police?" Her laugh was short and humorless. "Because my family is who I'm running from, and the police work for the same people my family pays." I didn't answer right away. Instead, I set my camera down on the nearest pew, slow, the way you'd set down anything in front of someone who might startle, and I looked at her properly. The torn dress, the bleeding collarbone, the eyes that kept flicking toward the chapel doors like she expected them to open any second and swallow her whole. "Sit down," I said finally. "You're bleeding, and it's not like either of us is going anywhere." She looked at me for a long moment, like she hadn't expected kindness to be an option on the table, and then, carefully, like her body had forgotten how to trust a soft surface, she sat. "I found a first aid kit in my equipment bag. I always carried one. Weddings were dangerous in their own particular ways. 3-inch heels and champagne flutes and overexcited flower girls. And I knelt in front of her in the candlelight and cleaned the small cut at her collarbone, while the storm built outside and neither of us said anything for a while. Her hands, when they weren't shaking, were elegant in a way that made me think of piano lessons and finishing schools. Mine were rough at the knuckles from years of camera straps and cold outdoor shoots. I noticed the contrast the way I notice light. Automatically, professionally, the part of my brain that had spent a decade learning to see people clearly, even when they were performing for a lens. "You're not what I expected," she said quietly, watching me work. "What did you expect? Someone who'd scream, or run, or try to sell my location to a tabloid before I even finished my sentence?" "I don't have very good cell service," I said. "Selling you out would require walking to a hilltop." That got the smallest laugh out of her, real and surprised, like she hadn't planned on laughing tonight and wasn't sure what to do with the sound. "Nora," I added. "My name's Nora Bellamy. I'm a wedding photographer. I was supposed to be shooting your wedding tomorrow, which I'm guessing now isn't happening." Seraphina, as if I didn't already know. As if the name hadn't been printed above 1,000 headlines about the Vale hotel empire and its unmarried heiress. And no, it isn't. Not if I have anything to do with it. I taped the small bandage into place and sat back on my heels, studying her. "So tell me what happened. Because if you want me to lie for you, I'm at least going to know what I'm lying about." Before we return to the story, I just want to share a quick note. This version is made for YouTube, but the uncensored GL scenes and hotter videos will be available on my Patreon. Some moments are too spicy to include here, so if you want the fuller and bolder version, you can find the details in the description below. Seraphina drew her knees up under the ruined skirt of her dress and wrapped her arms around them, and in the candlelight she looked less like an heiress and more like a girl who'd been crying somewhere private for a very long time before I found her. "There was a document," she said finally. "A private one. My mother's lawyers drew it up years ago. A contract tying the Vale Hotel Group to Crest Capital through my marriage. If I marry Julian, the merger goes through, and both companies survive whatever debt they're both hiding. If I don't, my family loses everything they've spent 3 generations building. That's what they told me anyway. That's the story I was raised inside. And tonight? Tonight I found out the debt isn't real. Or it's real, but it's not why the marriage matters." Her fingers twisted in the torn lace at her knee. "Julian's company is under federal investigation. Fraud, I think. Something to do with falsified valuations on 3 of their properties. If the merger with my family's hotels goes through before the investigation concludes, it buries the numbers under ours. My mother knows. She's known for months. She was going to let me marry into it anyway, because the Vale name protects everyone standing next to it, and Julian was counting on that." I sat with that for a moment, the rain drumming harder against the stained glass. "So you ran." "I ran," she agreed. "During the rehearsal dinner, I told my mother I needed air. I climbed out of a service door in $500 of couture, and I have been hiding in this building for 2 hours, trying to decide whether I'm insane." "You're not insane." I surprised myself saying it, and meant it. You're 26 years old and someone tried to marry you to a federal indictment. That's not insanity. That's math. Something in her face loosened, just slightly, like she'd been braced for me to tell her the opposite. You believe me. I believe you believe it, I said honestly. I don't know you well enough yet to believe anything at face value. But I've photographed enough weddings to know what a trapped bride looks like before she puts her performance face on for the ceremony. You don't have your performance face on right now. No, she said softly. I don't think I have it in me tonight. I should have called it there. I should have said I was sorry, that this wasn't my problem, that I had a career built on being invisible and reliable and absolutely nowhere near tabloid scandals, and the safest thing I could do was wait for the storm to pass and the doors to unlock and go home and forget I'd ever met Seraphina Vale. But there was a rawness in her voice that reminded me of something I'd buried a long time ago, the particular loneliness of being loved for what you represented instead of what you were, of smiling through cameras while something inside you quietly starved. I knew that loneliness. I'd built a career photographing other people's happiness while carrying my own absence of it like a stone in my chest, ever since Heiress left with someone else's promises still warm on her tongue. If I do this, I said slowly, if I say you were with me, I need to know what happens next. Because an alibi isn't a solution. It's a delay. Eventually, someone asks a harder question than where were you? I know. Seraphina looked at me with something like gratitude and something like fear, tangled together. I just need until morning. I need enough time to reach someone who can help me get the real documents. Proof of the fraud, proof my mother knew, before Julian's people find me first and drag me back to the altar with a smile stapled on my face. Outside, the storm broke fully open, rain hammering the roof like static, and somewhere beyond the chapel walls I thought I heard the distant sweep of headlights, a car moving slow along the gravel drive, searching. Seraphina went rigid. That's them. I looked at the locked doors, at the candlelit dark, at the woman in the ruined dress who had just handed me the truth, like it was something fragile she couldn't carry alone anymore. And I made a decision that would rearrange the rest of my year. Get behind the choir screen, I said, already moving to blow out the candles nearest the windows. And whoever asks, you've been with me the whole time. We got locked in together. Simple as that. She looked at me like I'd handed her the sky. Why are you helping me? I didn't have a good answer yet, so I gave her the honest one instead, because nobody ever helped me when I needed it, and I'm tired of pretending that doesn't still bother me. The headlights swept past without stopping. A caretaker's truck, it turned out, not searching for anyone, just checking the grounds before the storm worsened. And Seraphina and I sat together in the dark chapel for the rest of that long night, trading fragments of ourselves the way strangers do when circumstances strip away the reason to perform. She told me about a childhood spent being dressed for cameras before she could walk steadily in heels. I told her about photographing love I didn't believe in anymore, about an ex-girlfriend named Heiress who had used 2 years of my devotion as a soft place to land, before leaving for someone with better prospects. Somewhere near 4 a.m, exhausted past pretense, she fell asleep against my shoulder, and I sat very still in the candlelight so I wouldn't wake her, memorizing the unguarded honesty of her face in a way I usually only allowed myself to do through a lens. Somewhere around 2 a.m, when the candles had burned low and the storm had settled into a steady, patient rain, Seraphina asked me about my camera. You carry it like it's part of your arm, she said, watching me check the settings out of nervous habit, the same way some people twist rings or bite their nails. Do you ever put it down? Not often. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the familiar weight of it, the worn leather strap softened by years of use. My mother used to say I hid behind it. She wasn't wrong. It's easier to watch a room than to be watched by one. What are you hiding from? I hadn't meant to answer honestly, but something about the candlelight, the storm, the strange intimacy of being trapped together with nowhere to perform for, loosened something in my chest. Being left, I think. I dated someone for 2 years who made me believe we were building something permanent. Heiress. She used to say we'd grow old in the same house, same terrible secondhand furniture, same arguments about whose turn it was to do dishes. Then she met someone with better prospects and left in a weekend. Took the furniture, actually. I photograph other people's promises for a living because I stopped trusting my own. Seraphina was quiet for a moment, turning that over. That's a strange kind of bravery, she said finally. Building a career out of the thing that broke you. I never thought of it as bravery. It is. She looked at me steadily, something soft and searching in her expression. I spent my whole life performing devotion I didn't feel, for a family that mistook obedience for love. You spent yours capturing devotion you'd stopped believing in. For strangers. I think we've both been very lonely in very different rooms. I didn't have an answer for that. I just sat with her in the candlelight, listening to the rain, feeling, for the first time in longer than I wanted to admit, less alone in my own particular room. Tell me something true, she said suddenly. Something you've never told a client, or a friend, or anyone who might use it against you. I thought about it. I still keep one photograph of Heiress in a drawer I never open. Not because I miss her, because I'm afraid if I throw it away, I'll forget I'm capable of wanting someone that much, and I don't know if I'll ever get the wanting back. Seraphina reached over, slow and careful, and laced her fingers loosely through mine. Not romantic yet, not quite, but something gentler than a stranger's comfort. You'll get it back, she said. I don't think people like you lose the capacity for it. I think you just misplace it for a while. Your turn, I said, throat tight. Something true. She was quiet for a long moment, watching the candle flames bend in the draft. I used to practice smiling in mirrors as a child, she said finally. Not because I was vain, because my mother would critique the angle of my mouth in photographs, and I learned to correct it before the camera ever caught me wrong. I'm 26 years old, and I still don't know what my real smile looks like, because I've spent so long perfecting the one that photographs well. Can I see it? I asked. The real one. Whatever it is. She looked at me, startled, like no one had ever asked her that question before. And then, slowly, uncertainly, something shifted in her face, smaller than her practiced smile, crooked at one corner, entirely unrehearsed. There it is, I said softly, and meant it as the compliment it was. By the time the caretaker unlocked the doors at dawn, we had a story, and something neither of us named yet that felt dangerously close to the beginning of trust. The scandal broke by 9 that morning, the way these things always do. First a whisper, then a headline, then a wildfire no one could contain. Vale Heiress vanishes before wedding. Julian Crest stood in front of cameras looking appropriately devastated, saying words like worried and hope she's safe, in a voice so smooth it made my skin crawl even through a phone screen. Octavia Vale, Seraphina's mother, gave no statement at all, which somehow felt more menacing than anything Julian said. I drove Seraphina to my apartment in the gray hour after the chapel doors opened, both of us wrapped in the borrowed dignity of my old car's heater, and a story that wouldn't survive close inspection. She wore my spare coat over what remained of the wedding dress, hood up, sunglasses on despite the rain, folding herself smaller in the passenger seat than someone her height should have been able to manage. You don't have to keep helping me, she said, somewhere past the second stoplight. You could still walk away. Tell them the truth, that I forced you into it. You didn't force me into anything. I kept my eyes on the road, my knuckles pale on the wheel. I chose this. I'm allowed to choose things. She was quiet for a while after that, watching the rain streak sideways across the window. Nobody's ever let me watch them choose me before, she said finally, so softly I almost missed it. Usually it's the family name they choose, or the money, or the photographs. I glanced at her, at the exhaustion carved into her face, at the mascara she still hadn't washed off, and felt something shift in my chest that I didn't have room to examine yet. Well, I said, get used to it. I'm stubborn once I decide something. By evening, chapel security footage had surfaced, grainy black and white proof that I had entered St. Adeline's alone the previous afternoon and hadn't left until morning, with no clear record of a second person. It should have unraveled everything. Instead, someone on the internet noticed the timing lined up suspiciously well with Seraphina's disappearance, and by the time I checked my phone that night, my name was trending beside hers under a headline that made my stomach drop clean through the floor. Who is Nora Bellamy? The photographer Seraphina Vale vanished with. "This is bad," I said, staring at my screen from the edge of my own couch, while Seraphina sat curled in the armchair across from me, still wearing my old college hoodie because it was the only thing in my closet that fit her without looking like a costume. "This is very bad," she agreed, but there was something almost rueful in her voice. "Welcome to my life. Everything becomes a headline within 6 hours. I have 3 wedding shoots booked this month. If clients think I'm involved in some runaway bride scandal, they'll cancel," she finished quietly. "I know, I'm sorry." I looked at her, at the genuine guilt on her face, and something in me softened despite every practical reason it shouldn't have. "It's not your fault that your mother tried to marry you to a fraud case." "No," Seraphina said, "but it is my fault that you're caught in the wreckage of it." The wreckage got worse before it got better. 2 days later, a tabloid ran side-by-side photos of Seraphina and me from the chapel security footage, grainy and inconclusive but suggestive enough, under the headline, "Secret Romance or Convenient Cover?" And by that point, the fake alibi had curdled into something the internet found far more interesting than a missing document or a fraud investigation. People didn't want the complicated truth. They wanted a scandal, with a shape they recognized, and a runaway heiress falling for the woman who hid her was exactly that shape. "We could deny it," I said, pacing my small kitchen while Seraphina sat at the table nursing coffee she'd made too strong on purpose, some nervous habit I was only starting to learn about her. "Tell them the truth, that we were locked in together, that's all, nothing more." "If we deny it," she said carefully, "they dig harder for what actually happened. Julian's people are already asking why chapel security shows only one entry. If the story is romance instead of conspiracy, it protects the real reason I ran. It's a smaller fire to put out. So we just let them believe it? For now." She looked up at me, and there was something careful and searching in her expression, like she was gauging how much honesty I could hold without flinching. "Unless it's a problem for you. Pretending." I thought about Heiress, about years spent performing a relationship that never had the substance she claimed it did, about how tired I already was of my life being narrated by other people's assumptions. And then I thought about the way Seraphina had looked at me in the chapel candlelight, like I was something worth trusting, and realized the pretending didn't feel entirely like pretending anymore. "It's not a problem," I said, quieter than I meant to. "As long as we set boundaries. This isn't real. We don't perform it when it's just us." "Understood," she said, and something in her voice sounded almost disappointed, though I told myself I'd imagined it. We fled the apartment 2 mornings later, when a photographer camped outside my building for the 3rd day running finally cornered my landlord for a comment. Mara, my older sister, met us at a gas station outside the city limits with a bag of clothes she'd smuggled out of my apartment, and a look on her face that mixed worry with barely restrained curiosity. "You locked yourself in a wedding chapel with a hotel heiress," she said, arms crossed, eyeing Seraphina, dressed now in jeans and one of my old sweaters, sunglasses pushed up into unstyled hair, like she couldn't quite believe the tabloids weren't lying for once. "This is either the most reckless thing you've ever done, or the most interesting." "Can it be both?" I asked. "With you, it's usually both." Mara softened, glancing at Seraphina with something gentler. "Take care of my sister. She gives everyone else the benefit of the doubt and never asks for it back." "I'm trying to," Seraphina said, and meant it in a way that settled something uneasy in my chest. We spent the next 4 days moving between a string of cheap roadside motels, the kind with flickering vacancy signs and mattresses that had seen better decades, paying cash so nothing traced back to either of us. It should have been miserable. In a lot of ways it was. The fear of being found, the guilt of watching 2 of my wedding clients quietly cancel via terse emails, the strange vertigo of being a stranger in my own scandal-shaped life. But there were other moments too, moments I hadn't expected to want to keep. Seraphina teaching herself to make instant coffee taste less like punishment, swearing softly in French when it still came out bitter. Seraphina asleep against the window of my old car somewhere past midnight, moonlight sliding pale across her face, looking for the first time since I'd met her like a person instead of a headline. Me, teaching her, half as a joke, half not, how to walk through a gas station without drawing attention, Shoulders low, eyes soft, the particular art of disappearing I'd learned covering weddings, where I needed to be invisible enough to capture the truth. "You're good at this," she told me one night, both of us sitting on the hood of my car outside a motel in some town I'd already forgotten the name of, sharing a bag of gas station chips under a sky finally clear of storm clouds. Disappearing. Being unseen. "Occupational hazard," I said. "Best wedding photos happen when nobody remembers you're in the room." "I've never been unseen in my life," she said, quiet, looking up at the stars instead of me. "Not once. There's always been a camera, or my mother's expectations, or Julian's PR team deciding which version of me gets released to the public. I used to think I'd hate being invisible. Turns out I think I might love it." I looked at her. Moonlight on her collarbone where the small cut from that first night had already begun to heal, the soft, unguarded curve of her mouth, the way she'd started letting silences sit instead of filling them with performance, and felt something shift dangerously close to the center of my chest. "You're not invisible to me," I said, before I could stop myself. She turned to look at me then, something fragile and hopeful crossing her face. "No," she agreed softly. "I don't think I am." I looked away first, because the moment felt like standing too close to an open flame, and neither of us mentioned it again that night. But something had shifted, quiet and undeniable, and we both knew it. On the 5th day, in a laundromat outside a town too small to have a proper name, my ex-girlfriend found us by pure, terrible coincidence. I saw Heiress before Seraphina did, recognized the particular way she still tilted her head when she was pretending not to notice someone, a habit I'd once found endearing and now just found exhausting. She was folding a stranger's shirt at the machine 2 down from ours, visiting her mother in town, she explained, like the universe owed me no better excuse than small-town gravity. Nora. Her eyes moved from me to Seraphina, sunglasses pushed up into unstyled hair, and widened with the particular hunger of someone recognizing a headline in the flesh. "Oh my God. Is that... You're the one from the news." "We're just doing laundry," I said, too fast, stepping slightly between them out of some instinct I didn't examine closely. Iris's gaze slid back to me, softer now, assessing. "You look good," she said, in the voice she used to use right before asking for something. "Tired, but good. Are you two?" "Together," Seraphina said, before I could answer, sliding her hand into mine with a calm, deliberate ease that surprised me more than it should have. "We are, yes." Iris blinked, some old proprietary flicker crossing her face, the specific look of someone realizing they'd left something behind, and only now, watching someone else hold it, understood its worth. "Good for you," she said, and the words came out thinner than she probably meant them to. "I always wondered if you'd let yourself want something again after me." "I did," I said simply. "It just took the right person to teach me how." We left before the dryer finished, and it wasn't until we were back in the car, gravel crunching under the tires, that Seraphina finally spoke. "I shouldn't have said that. About us being together. I overstepped." "You didn't." I glanced at her, surprised by how certain I felt saying it. "It's true. I just hadn't said it out loud yet." She looked at me for a long moment, something vulnerable moving behind her composure. "I got jealous," she admitted quietly, watching her look at you like she still had some claim on you. It surprised me, how much it bothered me. "For what it's worth," I said, "I got the same feeling in my chest every time you had to smile for a camera next to Julian this past year, like watching someone hold something that was never really theirs and pretend otherwise. That's different. That was performance." It didn't feel different from where I was standing. She reached over and took my hand again, this time without an audience to perform for, and we drove the rest of the way to the next motel in a silence that felt, for the first time since the chapel, entirely comfortable. That night, in a room with peeling wallpaper and a heater that rattled like it resented existing, Seraphina fell asleep with her head on my shoulder, before either of us had said goodnight properly, exhaustion finally outpacing her guard. I sat very still in the dark, one arm curled carefully around her, watching the neon motel sign flicker red and blue through the thin curtains, and thought about how strange it was that the safest I'd felt in years had arrived wearing a torn wedding dress, and asking me to lie for her. Detective Ren Alvarez found us on the 6th day, calm and unhurried in a way that somehow felt more dangerous than if he'd shouted. He caught up with us at a diner outside the county line, sliding into the booth across from us without asking, badge resting on the table between the ketchup and the sugar packets like a quiet threat. "Miss Vale," he said, and then, with a small nod, "Miss Bellamy, I've been asked to locate you both. Officially, it's a welfare check. Unofficially, Julian Crest's lawyers filed a report suggesting Miss Bellamy may have facilitated an unlawful disappearance." "That's not what happened," I said, too fast. "I believe you," Alvarez said, surprising me. For what it's worth, I've been a detective long enough to recognize when a story's been built for a headline instead of a courtroom. But I need something more than my instinct if I'm going to keep this from turning into a warrant. He looked at Seraphina, steady and unthreatening. "You said the chapel footage shows you never left. If that's the story, I need to understand why you ran in the first place. Because right now, all anyone official has on record is Runaway Bride, and that story doesn't hold up under real scrutiny for long." Seraphina's hands tightened around her coffee cup, and I watched her weigh, visibly, the cost of trusting one more stranger with the truth. Finally, she reached into the lining of the jacket she'd been wearing since the chapel. My jacket, I realized, the one I'd draped over her that first morning, and pulled out a small flash drive I hadn't known she was carrying. "I copied files off my mother's home server 2 nights before the wedding," she said quietly. "Financial records, correspondence between her legal team and Crest Capitals, proof they both knew about the fraud investigation before the merger contract was signed. I was going to use it as leverage to get out of the marriage quietly. Then I realized quiet wasn't going to work, so I ran instead." Alvarez studied the drive like it might combust. "That's evidence, Miss Vale. Real evidence if it's authentic." "It's authentic," Seraphina said. "I just haven't had anyone I trusted enough to hand it to." Slowly, deliberately, she set it on the table between them, and I understood. Watching her do it, watching the particular bravery it took for a woman raised to guard every secret to finally hand one over, that something in her had decided, sometime in the last 6 days, that survival didn't have to mean doing it alone anymore. Alvarez took the drive and gave us 48 hours before he'd be obligated to report the contact, which he framed as a courtesy and I understood as a mercy. We used the time the only way we knew how, driving toward the coast, toward a stretch of gray beach town where Seraphina said her family had never once vacationed, which made it, in her words, the safest place left. It was in a greenhouse behind a bed and breakfast, 3 days before everything came to a head, that the careful boundary between pretend and real finally cracked. The greenhouse belonged to the inn's elderly owner, a woman who grew orchids and asked no questions, and Seraphina had wandered in after dinner, while I photographed the light falling green and gold through the glass panes, old habits refusing to switch off even in hiding. She stood among the flowers in the fading light, one hand trailing along a row of white blooms that reminded me uncomfortably of the roses at St. Adeline's, and when she turned to find me watching her through the lens instead of taking a picture, she didn't flinch away the way most people do. "Take it," she said softly. "The photo." "I don't want you as a subject," I admitted, lowering the camera. "I want you as... I don't know how to say it without sounding ridiculous. Try anyway." She crossed the small space between the orchid tables, bare feet on cool tile, and stopped close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in her eyes, catching the last of the sun. "I've had a lifetime of people who only wanted the photograph. I'd like to know what it feels like to be wanted as something else." "You're not a headline to me," I said, voice rougher than I meant it to be. "You're not an alibi, or a scandal, or somebody's leverage. You're the first thing that's made me want to put the camera down in years." Something in her face broke open, gentle and unguarded. "Nora, I know I said we don't pretend when it's just us," I said, half a warning, half a plea. "I don't think this is pretending anymore." "No," she whispered, close enough now that I could feel her breath against my jaw. "I don't think it is either." I don't know which of us moved first. It didn't matter. Her hand found the collar of my shirt. Mine found the curve of her waist. And when our mouths finally met, it was slow and searching, careful in the way first kisses are, when both people are afraid of wanting something too much. She tasted like the peppermint tea she'd been drinking to calm her nerves, and she made a small, soft sound against my mouth that undid something I'd kept locked tight since Heiress left, some old certainty that I wasn't built for being chosen. We broke apart only when we had to breathe, foreheads resting together among the orchids, both of us slightly stunned. "I don't want to be another escape route for you," I said, quiet and honest, the fear finally finding words. "I've watched people run toward comfort before. I don't want to be a stop on the way to somewhere else." Seraphina pulled back just enough to look at me properly, her thumb brushing gentle along my jaw. "You're not an escape route, Nora. You're the first place I've ever wanted to stay." The 48 hours ran out 3 days after that, but not before Octavia Vale requested, demanded, really, in the particular way that sounded polite on paper and threatening in person, a private dinner at the family estate, hoping, I suspected, to resolve the entire scandal quietly before it reached the gala at all. I wasn't invited. Seraphina insisted I come anyway. "If she wants to negotiate my future," she said, buttoning a borrowed blazer, with hands that had gone steady in a way I hadn't seen from her before, "she can do it in front of the person I actually trust." The estate was exactly what I'd expected and somehow still managed to unsettle me. Marble floors that swallowed sound, portraits of Vale ancestors staring down with the same cold composure I recognized in Octavia's own face, a dining room set for 3, with more silverware than I'd used in my entire life combined. Octavia sat at the head of the table like a queen presiding over a trial, and Julian arrived 10 minutes late, smiling the smile he saved for cameras, as though the last week hadn't happened at all. "Seraphina," Octavia said, once the staff had served and retreated, "I've spoken with our lawyers. If you return quietly tonight, we can frame this entire episode as a pre-wedding anxiety attack, a private matter, handled privately. The wedding can be rescheduled for next month. No one needs to know about." Her eyes flicked toward me, cool and assessing. "Complications." "I'm not a complication," I said, before Seraphina could answer. "And I'm not going anywhere." Octavia's gaze sharpened on me like a blade finding its angle. "Miss Bellamy, I appreciate that my daughter finds you comforting, but you understand nothing about what's actually at stake here. 2 companies, hundreds of jobs, decades of family legacy. I understand that you knew about the fraud investigation before you signed the merger contract," I said evenly. "I understand that you were willing to let your daughter marry into a federal case to protect your bottom line. I understand plenty." Julian's polished expression flickered, just slightly, the mask slipping enough to reveal something colder underneath. "You have no idea what you're interfering with." "I have a very good idea," Seraphina said, finding her voice, steady now in a way that made my chest ache with pride. "I've had 6 days to think about it clearly, without anyone in this room telling me what to feel. I'm not marrying you, Julian. I'm not saving the merger. And Mother, I know you love the company. I used to think you loved me the same way, until I realized you'd never once asked what I wanted, only what I owed." "Everything you have," Octavia said, voice cracking for the first time I'd ever seen. "You have because of this family's name, because of decisions I made to protect it." "Then let me make my own decisions now," Seraphina said quietly, "even if they cost the name something. I'd rather be poor and honest than wealthy and owned." The dinner ended without resolution. Plates barely touched, and we left the estate in silence, gravel crunching beneath tires that felt, for once, like they were driving toward something instead of away from it. "That was either very brave or very stupid," I said once we'd cleared the gates. "Maybe both," Seraphina said, and there was something lighter in her voice than I'd heard since the chapel, like she'd set down a weight she'd been carrying since childhood. "I think I needed you there to say it out loud, though. I don't think I'd have found the words alone." "You'd have found them," I said. "I just got to watch you find them faster." 3 days later, the gala arrived, and with it, the confrontation neither of us could avoid any longer. We arrived together, uninvited, in a black dress I'd borrowed from Nora and Seraphina's own carefully chosen armor of pale blue silk, and the room went silent in that particular way rooms do when the story everyone's been reading suddenly walks in wearing its own consequences. Julian found us first, smooth and smiling for the cameras that had already begun flashing, his voice pitched low and dangerous beneath the performance. "Sarah, you've had your little adventure. It's time to come home." "I am home," Seraphina said, steady in a way I hadn't heard from her before, something forged in 6 days of motels and diners, an honest fear finally hardening into resolve. "This was never home, Julian. It was a transaction with a ballroom attached." Octavia arrived a moment later, cold and composed, and the two women faced each other across a gap that felt much wider than the marble floor between them. "You've embarrassed this family," Octavia said quietly, "for their ears only, though I stood close enough to hear every word. Whatever this photographer has convinced you of, she hasn't convinced me of anything," Seraphina said. "I convinced myself. I found your files, Mother. Yours and Julian's both. I know about the investigation. I know you were going to let me marry into a fraud case to save your merger." The room, which had been pretending not to listen, stopped pretending entirely. I stepped forward before I could talk myself out of it, camera in hand. Not to photograph a wedding this time, but to hand Detective Alvarez, who had arrived quietly 10 minutes earlier and now stood near the ballroom entrance, the small stack of printed timestamps I'd been compiling since that first night. Chapel security logs, motel receipts, a photograph I'd taken by accident of a document on Seraphina's flash drive, still open on my laptop screen the night she'd shown it to me, that clearly bore both Octavia's signature and a date that placed her knowledge of the fraud investigation months before the engagement was ever announced. "I'm a photographer," I said, my voice carrying further than I expected in the sudden hush. "I notice things other people miss. Timing, light, what's really happening in a room versus what people want the camera to see. And what I've seen over the last week is a woman who ran not from a wedding, but from being sold as collateral to keep 2 companies out of federal prison." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Cameras that had been trained on Seraphina's scandal now turned hungrily toward the unfolding one. And for the first time in this story, the narrative wasn't being written by Julian's PR team or Octavia's careful silence. It was being written by the truth. Alvarez stepped forward, calm as ever, taking the printed pages from my hand. "Miss Vale, Mrs. Vale, Mr. Crest, I'll need statements from all of you. We already have enough on file to open a formal inquiry into the merger's financial disclosures." Julian's practiced smile finally cracked, just slightly, just enough for the cameras to catch it forever. Octavia looked at her daughter for a long, unreadable moment, and something almost like grief moved behind her composed features. The recognition, maybe, of exactly how much she had been willing to sacrifice. "Seraphina." "I'm not staying to hear it," Seraphina said, quiet but unshaking. "I spent my whole life being what this family needed me to be. I'm done. I'm choosing something else now." She turned, found my hand in the chaos of flashing cameras, and shouted questions, and together we walked out of the gala into a night finally free of storms. The investigation took months to unravel fully. Federal fraud charges against Crest Capital, a quiet but thorough dismantling of the merger, Octavia's own legal troubles for concealment, that I heard about secondhand through news alerts neither of us sought out anymore. But the months weren't a straight line toward happiness. 2 weeks after the gala, Octavia summoned Seraphina back to the estate one final time, and Seraphina went alone, insisting I stay behind, worried that my presence would only harden her mother's resolve. She came back that night, pale and quiet, and told me, sitting on the edge of my bed with her hands twisted together in her lap, that Octavia had offered her a choice: return to the family fully, help manage the fallout, salvage what remained of the Vale name from within, or lose access to everything: the properties, the trust fund, the identity she'd spent 26 years being taught to depend on. "What did you tell her?" I asked, throat tight. "I told her I needed time," Seraphina admitted. "And then I came home and realized I'd already called this place home in my head, and I didn't know how to say that out loud without it sounding like I was choosing you over an entire inheritance." "Are you?" "I don't know yet," she said, and the honesty of it, raw and unflattering, hurt more than a clean lie would have. I've spent my whole life being told love and money were the same transaction. I don't know how to separate them yet. I need to figure that out without you standing there, wanting a particular answer. She left 3 days later. Not fleeing, she was careful to clarify, just returning to the estate temporarily, to sort through what remained of her family's collapse, and decide, on her own terms this time, what she actually wanted to keep. I told her I understood. I didn't. Not fully. Not in the moment. It felt like watching someone I loved walk back toward the very cage she'd nearly died escaping. The weeks that followed were some of the loneliest of my life, stranger even than the loneliness before I'd met her, because now I knew precisely what I was missing. I threw myself back into work, rebuilding my studio, taking every wedding booking that came my way, filling my hours so there'd be less room for the ache. Mara checked in more than usual, gently, without pushing. "You look like you did after Heiress," she said one evening, finding me editing photos at 2 a.m, screen glow the only light in the apartment. "It's not the same," I said. "Heiress left because she wanted better. Seraphina left because she's trying to become someone who can choose me without it costing her everything else. Do you believe that?" "I want to." Seraphina called sometimes, brief and careful conversations that never quite settled the ache. Updates on legal proceedings, on her mother's shifting moods, on the strange grief of watching an empire she'd never wanted crumble anyway. She sounded tired in a new way. Not the exhausted fear of that first chapel night, but something more like mourning, the slow work of letting go of a life that had shaped her even as it suffocated her. "I miss you," she told me once, voice small over a bad connection. "I don't know how to say that without it sounding like I'm asking you to wait." "Then don't ask," I said. "Just say it. I'll decide what to do with it myself." "I miss you," she said again, steadier. "That's all. No conditions attached." It was 5 weeks before she came back. Not summoned, not fleeing, but walking, deliberately, into my studio on a gray Tuesday afternoon with a single suitcase and an expression I hadn't seen on her before. Certainty, plain and unadorned, the particular calm of someone who has finally stopped negotiating with herself. "I signed the last of the paperwork this morning," she said, standing in my doorway like she wasn't sure yet whether she was allowed to cross the threshold. "I kept a small trust my grandmother left me, separate from the company, enough to be independent but not enough to buy anyone's loyalty. Everything else I let go. The board seat, the properties, the name recognition. My mother hasn't spoken to me in 9 days. Are you okay?" "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but I'm free, and I wanted to be free somewhere near you, if you'll still have me." I crossed the room and pulled her into me before she could finish doubting herself, and she came apart a little in my arms, the particular relief of someone who has spent weeks bracing for rejection and finally set the fear down. "I'm not going anywhere," I told her, into her hair, meaning it with every unguarded piece of myself I had left. "I told you. I choose things. I chose you. In a locked chapel with a storm outside and no idea what I was getting into. And I'd choose you again in every version of this story. Even the version where I have nothing left to offer you? Especially that version," I said. "That's the only version where I know for certain you're choosing me back, and not just the safest exit available. My photography career, against every fear I'd carried through those chaotic weeks, didn't die in the scandal. It transformed instead. Word got around, slowly and then all at once, that the photographer at the center of the Vale story hadn't lied for money or fame, but had risked her livelihood to help someone escape a genuine injustice. Clients who'd once canceled came back sheepish. New ones arrived specifically because of the story, wanting the woman who photographed truth even when it was inconvenient. I turned down more weddings than I accepted that year, choosing instead the ones that felt real, the ones where I recognized, behind the veils and the flower arrangements, the particular unguarded look of two people who had chosen each other and meant it. Seraphina, meanwhile, found her own version of rebuilding. She used the modest trust from her grandmother to lease a small, weathered building on the coast. Not a Vale property, not anything with her family's polish, but a place with mismatched furniture, creaking floors, and a view of the water that made guests linger over coffee longer than they meant to. She called it the unlocked door, half as a joke between us and half as something truer than either of us said aloud. She hired staff who'd been let go from larger hotels for being too honest with guests, too generous with their time, too human for corporate metrics. Within 6 months, it was fully booked through the following spring, word of mouth carrying it further than any marketing budget her mother's properties had ever spent. We didn't rush anything. In the months that followed reunion, we'd both spent too long being defined by other people's timelines to fall into the trap of someone else's idea of how quickly love should move. We learned each other slowly, her laugh, easier now, unburdened. My old habit of disappearing behind a lens, softened by her insistence on being seen instead. We fought sometimes, over small things, and once over something larger. When she'd offered to quietly fund my studio's rebuilding after the scandal, and I'd refused, sharp and proud, unwilling to let love curdle into another transaction, dressed up prettier than the last. "I don't need rescuing," I told her that night, both of us standing in my newly reopened studio, paint still drying on one wall. "I need you. Those aren't the same thing." She'd looked at me for a long moment, something humbled and grateful moving across her face. "I'm still learning the difference," she admitted. "Nobody ever taught me that love could look like anything other than being provided for." "Then let me teach you something else," I said, gentler now. "Let me show you what it looks like when somebody chooses you for free." I sat behind her in the courthouse gallery the day she gave her formal testimony, 3 months after the gala, watching her walk to the stand in a plain gray dress, with no designer label anyone could name, no publicist coaching her expression from the wings. The prosecutor asked her to describe the night she'd run, and she did, clearly, steadily, without flourish, the fear and the fraud and the family pressure laid out in plain language for a room of strangers to judge. "Miss Vale," the defense attorney said, trying and failing to rattle her, "isn't it true you fabricated this story to escape an arranged marriage you simply didn't want?" "I didn't fabricate anything," Seraphina said. "I ran because I found proof of a crime the night before I was expected to marry into it. The marriage was inconvenient. The fraud was the reason I couldn't stay silent." When she stepped down from the stand, she found my eyes in the gallery before anyone else's, and something passed between us that no headline would ever capture correctly. Pride, relief, the quiet astonishment of watching someone become entirely themselves in front of a room built to diminish her. Julian was indicted 2 weeks later. Octavia settled her portion of the case quietly, out of court, her lawyers working overtime to keep the worst of it out of the papers, though the worst of it found its way out anyway, the way these things always do. Seraphina read the coverage once, then closed her laptop and never opened another article about it again. "I don't need to keep relitigating it," she told me. "I know what happened. That's enough." By early autumn, we'd fallen into something that looked, from the outside, almost ordinary. Mornings at her coastal inn, evenings at my studio, weekends split between both. Neither of us in any hurry to define the shape of it, beyond the plain fact that we wanted to keep waking up in the same rooms. She taught herself to cook, badly at first and then with real skill, insisting on Sunday dinners that neither of us was allowed to miss. I taught her to develop film the old way, in a cramped darkroom under red light, both of us laughing more than the process really called for. "You're happy," Mara observed one Sunday, watching us from across her own kitchen table, where we'd gathered for a dinner that had nothing to do with scandal or survival, just family. "Actually happy. I don't think I've seen that since before Heiress." "I don't think I've felt it since before Heiress," I admitted, glancing at Seraphina, who was laughing at something my sister's kids had said, entirely unguarded, entirely herself. "It took a locked door and a runaway heiress to get me back here." "Well," Mara said, raising her glass, "remind me to thank whoever built that chapel with a faulty lock." Nearly a year to the day after that first storm-locked night, Seraphina asked me to meet her at St. Adeline's. The chapel looked different in daylight, in spring, with the doors propped wide open and warm air moving freely through a space that had once felt like a trap. The caretaker, June, who I'd learned over the months, had known far more about the Vale family's history than she'd ever let on that first night, having quietly warned Seraphina's grandmother away from a similarly dangerous match decades earlier, waved us in with a knowing smile, and left us alone among the white roses. "You wanted to come back here," I said, camera slung over my shoulder out of habit rather than intention, watching Seraphina move slowly down the aisle where she'd once stood barefoot and desperate, asking a stranger to lie for her. "I wanted to see it without being afraid of it," she said. "And I wanted you to take one more photograph here. The last one, maybe, of this chapel, this place where everything actually started, even though we both spent weeks pretending it was just an accident." I raised the camera, framing her in the soft gold light spilling through the stained glass, the same light I'd been chasing that very first evening before the doors sealed shut behind me. She stood at the altar not as a runaway bride this time, not as a headline or a scandal or someone else's collateral, but simply as herself, steady, chosen, free. "Wait," she said, just as my finger found the shutter. "Put it down." "What?" "I don't want the last photo of this place to be one where you're behind the camera instead of standing next to me." I lowered it slowly, something warm unfurling in my chest as she crossed the space between us, unhurried, sure of herself in a way the frightened woman from that first storm-battered night could never have imagined becoming. "I love you," she said simply. No cameras, no headlines, no one to perform for but each other. "Not because you saved me, because you saw me. Nobody ever just saw me before you." "I love you too," I said, my voice breaking gently on the words. A year's worth of careful, guarded feeling finally given permission to speak plainly. "And for the record, you saved yourself. I just happened to be standing close enough to watch you do it." She laughed then, bright and unguarded, and kissed me in the middle of that quiet, unlocked chapel, sunlight warm across both our faces, roses blooming white and unwilted all around us. And when we finally stepped back out through doors that opened easily, freely, into a spring afternoon neither of us had to run from, I understood that the story I'd once thought had trapped me inside a chapel had actually been the night I finally walked into the rest of my life.